Hi everyone, welcome to today's seminar. Today's speaker is Nicholas Lawson. Nicholas is an associate professor from the Department of Aeronautical Engineering at the University of Sydney. He joined in October of 2021. And before that, he was at the School of Aerospace at Cranfield University. Nick has worked on laser and fiber optic flow diagnostic methods. His current research focuses on instrumentation for aerodynamic measurement, which I believe we'll be hearing about today. Take it away, Nick.
Thanks, Phil. Thank you. So I hope everyone can hear me. Can you all hear me online on Zoom? Okay, just speak up. Well, not speak up. Put a chat in if you want. So thanks for inviting me. This is actually the first formal lecture I've given, research lecture, since I've been here. So it's good to come to ACFR to do that. Just want to acknowledge country and traditional owners of the land on which we're on. We should never forget to do that, particularly in these kind of events. Okay. In terms of my background, I want to introduce myself a little bit first, because the ACFR Centre, there's definite connections with my research interests, but it might allow me to put a bit of context on why that is. Okay. So I'll talk about my research background, and then I'll talk a bit about this method PIV, which is a flow diagnostic method, and it goes all the way back to my PhD. I was working on this in the early 90s with people in the UK, and it was starting to pick up quite significantly in the 90s as a method. Okay, and then I'll talk about a couple of flow challenges, experimental challenges using these techniques. First one is an ambulance flow study, which was done in the COVID period. It was a bit of an interesting one because all of the universities shut their campuses in the UK, and the only way you could get onto the campus to do anything was you had to have research which was COVID relevant. And we ended up getting a bit of money from the Royal Academy of Engineering to do a flow diagnostic study inside an ambulance, because at the time they had no idea how the pathogens, say, were spreading in the vehicles. So that was an interesting one that I did, and I'll briefly talk about that today, because there's some data processing challenges with that. And there's a second one, which is relating to fiber optics, which I'll talk about. And then actually I'll mess one up. The second one is that's relating to, no, it is related to fiber optics. And the final one is a further fiber optic method, which I'll talk about, and the data processing around that. So in terms of my background, I started off my PhD doing PIV, particle image velocimetry. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And I actually moved to University of Melbourne and did more of this, and expanded into laser Doppler anemometry, which is again another laser-based flow diagnostic technique. When I was in the University of Melbourne, I was applying these methods to all sorts of interesting flows. That's actually me here, just on the picture, looking discreetly and distinctly younger than I am now, but I've continued to do this kind of work the last 20, 25 years. Just the applications have changed a little bit, and I've developed my techniques as I've done it. I got into fiber optic sensors when I moved back from University of Melbourne to Cranfield. There was a very strong photonics group there, and a world expert in fiber optic sensing. And I worked with him for nearly 20 years in Cranfield, where we did various projects and research grants. And so I'll talk a bit about that as well. I did teach for quite a long time, thermal fluids and propulsion, and aerodynamics as well. And then in the last 15 years at Cranfield, I got into flying. There was an airfield at Cranfield. Some of you may or may not know Cranfield, but it was a university about 80k north of London that was built on an RAF, ex-RAF airfield, and the university developed around that. And they had a flying laboratory there, so I ended up learning to fly, and I ended up flying for the flying laboratory there. and then ended up actually leading the flying laboratory eventually. So I was using that capability to develop measurement systems as well. And there's actually, if I go back to my list, the second one I'm talking about is actually related to that, not fibre optics. The final one's talking about fibre optics. And that's why I got some experience when I was flying commercially at Cranfield. We had to fly under commercial regulations, and I had quite a lot of experience of dealing with the regulator, dealing with the health and safety, dealing with lots of other things actually to do with flying. So, and some of it was a human factor element, and I've still got an interest in that now. Okay, and I did do flight instruction for a while, so a bit of a mixed background. But if you go to the top level, I still always had an interest, a keen interest in vision systems, flow diagnostics. It's always been a strong interest of mine. Okay. Just to give you an example as well, at Melbourne Uni, as well as looking at some of these wacky flows, we put some wacky instruments together. This is the 1990s. Digital stuff was nowhere near as advanced as it is now. You were lucky to get a CCD in the early 1990s that had about 400 by 400 pixels. It was quite, it depended on your budget, of course, but for lesser mortals, you were dealing with actually quite small digital devices, and they were quite slow as well. They were going at kind of tens of hertz in terms of frame rates. And actually, in the early 90s, there was still a lot of film used in the vision systems, particularly high-speed vision systems. We couldn't afford some of the high-end cording. There's a company in America, Cording, that makes very high-spec, high-speed vision systems. We couldn't afford that, so one of the projects I did on the right-hand side here was developing a high-speed camera. We did that internally in the faculty, and we used it to measure droplet breakup. There was quite a lot of numerical work going on trying to simulate droplet breakup when you get an impact on a surface, a free surface. And there was actually not a lot of data in particular situations. We ended up developing our own camera and getting data and comparing it to numerical methods. So that's quite an interesting instrument to develop for vision. When I got back to the UK, there was quite a lot of work on PIV. You can see, I'll talk about more the technique in a minute. In wind tunnels for Airbus, we did some work with Rolls-Royce as well. I continued to do work with laser Doppler on the right-hand side, looking at vehicle weights and other things. We did some work for the racing teams in the UK, doing flow diagnostics in some of their tunnels, which was quite an interesting thing. It continued and does to this day. The fibre optic area really developed with this relationship with photonics engineering, department at Cranfield University. And in my last couple of years, we were looking at developing pressure sensors and strain sensors with fibre optics, and some quite challenging applications. One of them, we got into the large transonic wind tunnel in the UK, Bedford, and we managed, if you look on the right there, we managed to fit a number of different sensors on one of their, they have these baseline models where they calibrate the tunnel and the force balances, and they gave us permission to fit these sensors on their baseline model. They call it kind of common model, so we could test our sensors and see how well they performed. And that was a really valuable thing because they have many hours of data from their traditional instruments with these baseline models. And so it was a good way of gauging our performance. And we looked at unsteady pressure, we looked at wing strain. There were some issues with our sensors. They certainly at that point weren't as accurate as the traditional sensors, but there were other issues coming up with their sensors, like they couldn't route them over long distances where you could with fibres. So there were some distinct advantages in using fibre optics, which was why they were interested in us testing in the tunnel. But fibres the big thing with fibers is they're always sensitive to temperature and something else. And so you end up spending a lot of effort trying to correct because one thing's affecting the other. And that's a common problem with fiber optic technology. All sensors have some sort of temperature dependency, but the fiber optics are typically very closely coupled. And we have Niels here today, who's a big man on fibers, so he would know that, and we could talk all day about it, Niels. The corrections you have to do with fiber optics. And one case in point is we flew some fiber optics on this aircraft at Cranfield. I'll talk a bit about that towards the end of the talk. And we tested pressure sensors and strain sensors. And we did get them to work, but again, there were some ongoing issues. And it was work in progress when I got out of Cranfield. We did manage to get successful strain and pressure sensing actually on the aircraft, but still some issues around corrections and errors. Okay, so onto the first bit of the course, the talk today about PIV. PIV looks like a simple technique. You put a laser sheet in the flow, you seed the flow, you have a digital camera, you pulse the laser, and you're seeding in the flow, your smoke or your particles in the flow. They're recorded by the sensor, and you effectively you get a series of images with like a time history of the flow through the particle images. And then you generally use some sort of correlation method or other image processing to output your vector map. And that's a pretty standard, this is a two-dimensional PIV system. There's nothing really unusual about this. And there's a lot of work done in the 1990s on how to optimize this. And I'll talk a bit about this because that work that was done in the 90s is still relevant today, and it's relevant to any correlation processing that you try to do in terms of errors and how errors. The thing you find with the errors, and particularly in these correlation methods, is that one is always you can improve one error, but it generates another error. So you there is an optimum, but you're always got one error popping up when another one's going down, and that's a common issue. And there's usually other factors that drive your errors in these sort of methods. And it doesn't matter whether you're doing some robotics and trying to track something, or whether you're trying to correlate particles. It's the same problem. And if someone stands up and says to me, "Oh yeah, no, I've got no error," I won't believe you, because there's always one other error competing with the other. Okay, so and hopefully in a minute you'll see what I mean. With PIV processing, the original type of processing that was done right back in the 90s, where the digital technology wasn't particularly good, was you would double pulse both of your images onto one transparency, effectively, or one photo. So we were still using film. So you would store both the pulses on one image, and then you process it with this method, autocorrelation, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. The autocorrelation works very well, but the problem is you get self-correlation in the middle, which is a huge peak depending on how the quality of your images are, and you get two peaks telling you the statistically dominant direction. The problem is that this peak can contaminate the actual signal that you're trying to get, particularly when you get small displacements, and you get ambiguity. There's no information about the direction of the flow. And in the 90s, there was a lot of work done by various groups trying to, because we couldn't, we didn't have the digital devices to overcome this ambiguity problem. And it was an interesting time. But then, of course, digital technology got much better, and you moved to cross correlation, where you could separate the image one or the pulse one or pulse two. You separate them on two different images, and obviously now you don't have the ambiguity problem. You don't have the self-correlation peak. That's all gone. And you also find, because there's less correlation between the different particles, you get less noise in your image. So everything gets better when you cross-correlate, and everything now is cross-correlation. It's very rare that you find autocorrelation, but you can still use autocorrelation to check your signal quality, for example. That's a common thing in signal processing, is using autocorrelation for that. But so we're all in a kind of cross-correlation regime. But if we go a little bit, even though we're cross-correlating, we still have a lot of problems with associated with errors, and this is, we'll talk about it. The autocorrelation plane that you get once you've correlated your two interrogation regions, your small regions in the flow with the particles, or particle images, that's what a typical autocorrelation looks like. You've got the two signal peaks, the zero peak and the noise floor, and it's relatively trivial to search around the interrogation region, find the peaks, and then you've still got the ambiguity problem, but it's easy image processing. Cross correlation, even easier, because you've got one peak and the noise floor is lower. Now these are really nice and clean, these correlation results. When you look at the basic theory, the peak, the signal peak, in this case RD, is proportional to the number of pairs, particle pairs that you're correlating. So more particle image pairs sounds good, you get a high peak. But the noise floor also goes up, because when you have more particle images in your little region, they're all self-correlating with each other. So the noise floor is that self-correlation, and obviously that goes up. So there is an optimum, and typically at the time people are talking about 10 to 20 particle image pairs were giving, with the resources we had and the resolution we had, that gave you about an optimum. There's no point going any higher because other noise factors come in with the noise floor. There's no point going lower because the peak just drops, okay? And then people started looking at, well, what's the random error on that peak? And there's a bias error when you go back to that peak. If you look at the peak, you have to find the peak to a subpixel position, and you typically run a curve fit, or you run a centroid on the peak. And so people are asking, well, okay, what sort of noise factors come in here with the result, particularly when you cross correlate, because you're getting to a very small displacement. You've got no zero peak now, so you can actually correlate images that have very small displacements between the two particle image pairs. And what you find is that if you look at the basic curve, that the bias error, which is relating to fitting your curve or other factors, but mainly fitting your curve, that will go down as you increase the number of pixels per particle image. So now we're looking at the pixel level, the particle image level, how many pixels on my particle image. If we go down to about 2 pixels for the particle image, the bias error now falls right off, because you can fit a curve really well on 2 or 3 pixels. But the random error goes up as the particle image size in terms of pixels goes up. The random error goes up because the self-correlations, all this background noise here, as the particle image size goes up, the noise in the background goes up, because you're getting more and more self-correlation, and the particle images are bigger and fatter, and they drive the noise floor up. So you've got a kind of sweet spot where you don't want the particle images to be too big, and you don't want the particle images to be too small, because if they're too small, you get bias error with your fit. If they're too big, you get too much random noise. So you've got to try and find this optimum point, which is 2 or 3 pixels. And that was quite a big find when people were doing it, okay? So it sounds like, oh, make the particle image bigger, make it 5, 6 pixels. Well, actually, you'll end up getting poorer performance, and you've got to find this optimum particle image size. And that's quite challenging. In PIV, you've got to try and get it to 2 to 3 pixels when you're taking images. And sometimes with noise and setups and optics, that's quite hard to do, okay? So you're not sitting on that optimum point, all right? In terms of the other major factor with this finding these peaks is spatial gradients. Now, all of these lovely, if you look on the left there, that's a lovely correlation. It's an autocorrelation, but the peaks are really distinct. They're really sharp, the signal peaks, the RDs. The one on the right, that's a correlation region that has a spatial gradient inside the image. So something is forcing the particle image pairs to change displacement within the interrogation region. And as soon as you have this spatial gradient, and you may have the same in some imaging system with a robotic application, if you get that spatial gradient on your data, what happens is the signal peak smears. So the signal peak falls off, and there is a signal peak on the right-hand correlation plane, but it's much lower because the energy in the signal peak is now smeared out, and the signal peak height falls with the spatial gradient, and that can severely affect your accuracy. You get bigger bias errors because now the peak is broader. It's behaving like big particle images, which we just talked about, and also the height of the peak is lower, so it's harder to find. So PIV doesn't take kindly to having spatial gradients with correlation methods. It really doesn't work very well. And then what you have to do is you have to assess quite carefully how big do you want to make your interrogation region, because you need to restrict the gradient that you're seeing across that given interrogation region. Otherwise, you'll lose your signal. It just drops out. You don't get a signal anymore. So there was a lot of work trying to kind of understand, well, can we do better with gradients? Can we do, and ultimately it comes down to how many particle image pairs have you got, how big are the particle images, and what's the spatial gradient? And these were all the three things driving your result and your level of error. And it doesn't matter what correlation method you use, it's going to be the same issue, whether you're doing vision systems or this, it's a similar problem, okay? And more work was done, and it just confirmed, you know, as the spatial gradients go up, the random error goes up because the peak is smeared, and the noise floor is now affecting the signal peak more, or, you know, you get harder problem to peak fit and you get bias errors. So with increasing velocity gradient in these two results, it was just clear that it's not where you want to be. You need to set your imaging system up to stop that. So yeah, try and reduce your, if you're doing correlation methods for your robotics applications, you need to consider this quite carefully, because you can end up with some substantial errors if you don't deal with it, okay, or you don't process it. And it doesn't matter how smart your correlation algorithm is. If the signal peak drops up and the noise floor goes up, you know, all bets are off. You'll either lose your signal or you'll get a lot of errors. And if you get a lot of errors, you're going to have to sample more and average more to get rid of this error. Okay, and that's just life. Sorry. Now, one thing that was done was trying to attempt to address the velocity gradient problem, was just to go down to individual particle pairs. So instead of correlating a region with 10 or 20 pairs, one of the trains of thought was, let's just go, we don't have a gradient then. If we have one pair, there's no gradient, because that's just a single result. There's not loads of them giving us a gradient. And there was quite a lot of work done on what was called super resolution PIV, and that's still used now, where what you do is you start with a larger interrogation region, and then you iteratively reduce the interrogation region size down to the point when you have one particle pair. So you start by correlating a large region, and you go down and down, and then get into an individual particle image pair. And that can work pretty well, and it's still used now. But you still have your random error, and you still have your bias error. You have your random error from just general image noise. You don't now have the self-correlation random noise, but you've still got image noise from your sensor, and that gives you a random error. And then you've still got bias. You've still got bias error. If you don't get the particle image size optimized, your bias error goes up. So you've still got to get good images to get good results, okay? So you might solve one problem, but the other problem's still there. That's that's been my life with PIV methods. It's just how it is. Some of the problems are always inherent. Okay, so as part of my postdoc, because there was a lot of work being done on PIV, I did develop my own algorithm, and it's quite important to have the right interface for PIV. So you're setting up your image environment correctly. And at the time, we had access to workstations and things, and it was quite a lot of it was manual type effort, moving around, looking at the image, making a kind of assessment. That maybe AI can do a better job of that now, but there was quite a lot of manual kind of knowledge and background setting up before you. So you needed the right interface to do that. Some of the commercial systems you could buy, but then they had limitations. So I developed my own software. I still got that. It was done on Linux or Unix and X Windows, and you can actually still get all of the interfaces working. And even up to a few months ago, I was using this software to benchmark some other software. It is amazing how the legacy code, this code was written in 1995, 96, and I can still use it now. It's quite remarkable given Linux and other systems. And it allows you to just set stuff up. You've got the right kind of environment where you can do a quick assessment of the image, and then you might change your delta T on your laser. You might change your magnification, look at the image again. So there's a little bit of judgment there, and this allows you to do that relatively quickly. And then you've got an interface which shows the correlation, how the correlation is working, vector map processing, all of that sort of stuff. And there is still some manual judgment involved in getting good PIV data, but maybe AI has a place for that. If anyone has an idea for a project with that, I'd be interested. So yeah, this software, I've still got it. And if people are interested in it, just approach me. I can talk to you about it. So the first application to talk about is this ambulance flow, which used actually, I dug my old PIV code out to deal with this kind of application. We're in the middle of COVID. It was very hard to do research, but it was quite hard. It was quite easy to get money to do research on COVID and a COVID-related application. We got hold of an NHS ambulance, and inside the ambulance, we decided to look at the flow. We mapped the flow in various parts around the ambulance based on the patient center line on the stretcher. So you can see here the light sheets bolted into the ambulance. We blacked out all the windows, and we were given the clear to go drive this ambulance around. So it was great because the cops wouldn't stop you. You're an ambulance. You know, you could drive on all the roads, do what you want, even in the middle of COVID. You know, police cars were pulling over people and doing sort of, we could drive where we wanted. It was great. And then inside we had this class 4 laser all set up. We could seed it, we could take data, whatever speed we wanted, well, up to the limit actually. But so it was an interesting couple of months where we were getting data. We tried a couple of different PIV setups out. The first one you can see on the picture here used smoke, because we knew this other seeder at the bottom here, and the seeder produces the particles, was really good. We knew this Levision seeder was really good, but there were hardly any available. So we had to wait for this. And the first few months of work, this kind of work was done over around 6 months. The first few months we worked with smoke, and that presents some problems I'll talk about. And there's my software that we ended up using. And with the smoke and the helium bubbles, we got some initial flow maps. You can see here, this kind of scale, about a meter, that's big in PIV. When you talk about an area which is a meter, that's quite big. It's hard work, and because of lighting and other things like that, and imaging. And the ambulance was like 3 meters by 3 meters inside. We had to do it in chunks, but we built up an idea of what the flow was doing by repeating some different positions with the light sheet. And then the other thing we found, this was quite interesting, was inside the ambulance, as the ambulance was accelerating or decelerating, we would go, so for example, we go on a dual carriageway or a highway, and I'd tell the driver, right, sit at 60 miles an hour, and we'd be sitting at 60 for 5 minutes. And then the flow, you'd see the flow inside would settle down in the back into this reasonably steady pattern, okay? And then as soon as the driver braked or went around the corner, the thing went haywire. So if you're looking at the flow here, this is a braking action in the ambulance. Suddenly the flow shoots forward. Because if you think about it, if you're doing 70 and the flow is doing 70 inside, it's steady. If you go to 60, the gas inside the vehicle is still doing 70. So for that moment when the vehicle brakes, the flow is disrupted and then it has to go steady again. And we didn't realize there's such an effect. And this is just braking on a roundabout. The whole flow pattern breaks down, this steady flow pattern. So that was a finding, and I've published some work on that. It was interesting times. Now, when we used the smoke, we found basically that it was quite hard to use smoke because you couldn't get individual particle images and the smoke's so fine. And a typical particle image looks like this on the right. It looks a bit like a galaxy, like a load of stars. We weren't getting that at all. We were getting these smoke patterns and we had to track them. But using the off-the-shelf PIV software just didn't work. And what we had to do is adapt. Well, we adapted my software so we could get very large, instead of the small images that you typically get with PIV, which is like 64 by 64, we looked at much bigger imaging areas, and we correlated not the particle images because it was hard to see particle images with the smoke. We ended up correlating the patterns. So we were actually over about a minute, you would get a nice steady load of patterns moving around in the flow, and then you could correlate those movement of those patterns and infer a velocity from that. And that worked quite well. Eventually the smoke all mixes up and you can't see a distinct pattern anymore. So you then have to flush all the smoke out, put the fans on, and then put the smoke in again, let the pattern develop, and then do the correlation based on that. And so we were looking at quite large areas in the big image anyway, like a 25 megapixel image. We took these larger areas and then tracked these patterns, and it worked quite well. We got some basic data. When we got the helium bubble seeder, oh, that was just brilliant. The quality of images with the helium bubble seeder was fantastic. So we kind of stepped up a gear once we, excuse the pun, once we got that. So that's the first application. I'll move on to the second one, which is to do with stall measurement. I may run out of time for the last bit on the fibre optic, but I'm actually happy to come back and do another seminar on that, because it's probably of interest to you, but we'll see where we get in the time, okay? So this one is in an aircraft, and what we do is we can put some very limited instrumentation in the aircraft. We can put accelerometers, we can have basic handheld equipment, and we're looking at things like the stall here. So if I run this movie, it will work. It's not working. Interesting. Let's try that. No. Okay, it's showing a stall. A stall is you bring an aircraft down in speed, the lift over the wing changes, and you get a flow separation on the wing, which just doesn't seem to be showing. We had a number of bits of different equipment in, some accelerometers, usual standard equipment in the aircraft like altimeters, and we were measuring a whole load of data during the stall. And during the stall, you get unsteady buffeting on the aircraft. Maybe these will work. Yeah. So we also did a CFD model, and this showed the same kind of result with the buffeting. And there's a distinct buffeting frequency which we were picking up because you get this wake interaction with the tailplane, which the CFD predicted quite well. And the experimental data was comparing quite well to it as well. The good thing was the tailplane wasn't stalling. So the main wing was stalled, you can see here, but the tailplane wasn't, which is a good thing to have on an aeroplane, but it was interacting with the tailplane. The wake was interacting and causing it to resonate. So we found this in accelerometer data by looking at periods in the stall. So you get stall, and then you get this shedding, this vortex shedding. And if you looked at the accelerometer data, you could see this is looking in the wake frequency area here. That's what you're looking at, where it's marked wake. You'd see the actual buffeting build up and the distinct buffeting frequency coming off the wing, and you pick that up with the accelerometer, and that actually worked quite well as a test without too much post-processing, to be honest. So we then looked at the back of the aircraft during the stall because with this interaction, and this is I'll stop that. This is a video of the rear view of the aircraft with a GoPro. So we fitted a GoPro on the camera, and we could get the cockpit view and the rear view simultaneously, like a 360. We focused on the rear view because that's where the wake was interacting with the tailplane. We wanted to see, could we image process that basic 360 data, the GoPro data, to see if we can get a similar result to what we were finding in the accelerometer. So the stall, the thing to look at is look at the tailplane area here, where you're getting the interaction. But we also did some further correlation on these areas I'll talk about in a minute. You can see the interaction now on the tailplane. And then the pilot has to recover, because otherwise it will spin. So it's basic GoPro footage, but you could see the aeroplane goes into the stall and it goes into this nodding behavior. So it's actually in a heavy stall, there's lots of buffet, but there's this additional behavior as well. And that's why we wanted to use a number of different areas. We used 3 areas to look at this data. If we look at that, the first window, there were those 3 windows. The first window was in the canopy, just around here. And we were using that area to check that there wasn't too much vibration, because we had to reference images to one another, and there's vibration at various parts of the flight. So we could deal with that using the canopy, because the canopy was a very stable point, that rail in the middle of the image. And then the second area we had was just around the tailplane, just here. And we were looking at the tailplane deflection, because that's where the wake was interacting. And then the final area we looked at was the big window just above the tailplane. And we wanted to track the pitch attitude because of this nodding behavior of the aircraft. And we managed to do all of these 3 with the correlation code that I had. It worked quite well. So if you look at, for example, a tailplane response, it picked up a good frequency there. And that actually matched the natural frequency of the structure, which we tested before we did the flight. So the wake, ironically, the aircraft designers never knew this, but the wake shedding frequency was nearly the same as the natural frequency of the tailplane, which isn't great. But that's what we found in the data, and it confirmed it. Then when we look at the big window, the pitch attitude, like how much the aeroplane's pitching, you can see the stall point, and you can kind of see this nodding behavior. And we could also pick up the yaw behavior. The interesting thing here is all I'm correlating is the cloud pattern. So the cloud pattern over the stall period, which is 5 or 10 seconds, the cloud pattern doesn't change because it's like an infinite image in the distance. And so you can correlate the aircraft behavior based on that cloud pattern, and it worked quite well. And so if we look at the cloud pattern, we can recover the pitch attitude and the yaw angle estimated. And we can do it throughout the stall, which was quite a nice thing to have. And then the recovery by the pilot. So that was a nice result. And we could also pick up this nodding frequency, which matched with published work on this kind of thing. So I think we'll probably run out of time. I don't know. I mean, I could go over the fiber optic method if you want, and then do a more detailed seminar on it later, but I'm wary of the time. So I can come back and do this again. What do you want to do, Mr. Chairman?
It's up to you. I mean, maybe
do you want to come in? What have I put you off enough, or do you want me to come back?
How long does it go?
You see, when I got to this point, I knew it was going to overrun. If I'd done the whole thing in detail, I would have way overrun. So I just put a couple of overheads. I can do those now and come back if you want. Yeah, all right. So with the Bulldog, this aircraft Bulldog, we fitted fibre optics. We did a load of work here. We had a wind tunnel model, and we used the wind tunnel model to work out the best place for the sensors, because the sensors the sensor pressure range we had to be confident that the sensor pressure range was going to match what we're getting in flight. So we did a wind tunnel test. Now, what we did is on the Bulldog, maybe I'll use a pointer at this point. So on the Bulldog, we fitted the pressure sensors on a little plate behind the back here. And then on the wing, we fitted the strain gauge sensors. So you can see here, there's a plate on the back with the pressure sensor, and we benchmarked it against an industry standard Coolite unsteady pressure sensor. And then we put these strain gauges, fibre optics. So these are all fibre optic driven, except the Coolite is conventional on this aircraft. We measured loads of other stuff as we did the actual flights. So I'll get out of this pointer. So then we went, we had to make the sensors. Well, I say we, it's a bit of a royal we. The Department of Photonics made the sensors, and they put these ferrules together with a diaphragm, a microphone diaphragm, which they adapted, and then you kind of set the fibre up to give you this Fabry-Perot cavity here. They were big sensors relatively, but we had to fit them in the aircraft to make sure it all was compliant with the airworthiness of the aircraft. And then this Fabry-Perot method, some of you are familiar, some of you not. You put this as a fibre optic, and you get a reflection of this end of a fibre, which is a polished end of a fibre optic in the core, and then you get a reflection off the diaphragm, and they interfere. You get this pattern, which depends on the wavelength. And as the actual diaphragm moves, the wavelength shift moves, and you can track that. And you can then pre-calibrate and get a pressure measurement with this basic principle. And it's very sensitive. We were getting 0.1 Pascal in the lab, really sensitive, 0.1 Pascal. Niels and I are doing a project at the moment, and we're trying to go a bit higher than that, but it worked really well. Now, when you get this pattern here, this spectrum that you're processing, you have to track these peaks, obviously. And we had some software which, we had this system, because it was an aircraft, we had to get a certified interrogator box. And this interrogator box, all it gave you was the peak positions. You couldn't recover the spectra. You could look at the spectra live on the laptop, but it was proprietary. They wouldn't release the spectra data, only the peaks. And what can happen is, in flight, as you're going up and down an altitude or changing condition, these peaks, they track the peaks okay. They do what's called peak phase. The phase gets too great, and basically the peak disappears off the side and then comes off the inside here. So the peak could go like that to the side and then suddenly appear on the side here. So the peak you're trying to track skips, and then it comes back in the other side on the spectrum as the diaphragm is expanding. And you've got to deal with that, because the data looks like this. It's all stepped, because as the peak is skipping and coming back in the other side of the spectrum, you've got to track it. So we had to do a load of software and develop a process where we had to recover the full range of the data by tracking this and tracking the skip as well. And we managed to do it. And then we recovered this data into the continuous data. And we recovered the flight data from that. So it was an interesting problem, but I can talk a bit more about this in another seminar. But we successfully recovered the data. And there were lots of other issues with the data, but I can talk about that another day. So just to close, I've flown through a lot of things here. Talked about PIV. Those challenges probably are relevant to you in terms of processing. Correlation methods, doesn't matter if you're looking at the face with a robot or trying to track it with correlation, or you're looking at particle images, same problems occur. And you have to be wary of things like gradients and other stuff in your image, and noise as well. And then fibre optic methods. Fibre optic methods always, when you look at them, they look really cool and simple, but it's the detail that can get you, particularly with the processing, things like the phase skipping that I talked about. And there's usually quite a lot of additional work needed to either correct them or get the data resolution that you need. And so it's kind of a general talk today, but it's it's just throwing out some ideas to you as well. Yeah. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Nick. We have a couple of questions, so if everyone put your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Great presentation. I have a question that's kind of more of a historical question.
Yes, yes.
So it was interesting hearing about kind of the early development of PIV and
Yes.
film to digital cameras, digital processing and so on.
Yeah.
Around similar sorts of times in robotics, kind of from the mid-90s onwards, there was a lot of interest in using optical flow for navigation, which is basically the same thing, how each in a camera image, how different parts of the image are moving.
Yeah.
And similar ideas we use, like cross-correlating patches, all the way down to trying to represent it as a PE and solve the PE and so on. Do you know, during that period, was there any interaction between the PIV field and the kind of optical flow robotics sort of field?
It's a good question, Ian. Interaction between even at Melbourne Uni between certain fluid mechanics groups and the faculty I was in was non-existent. People, particularly if they'd be like, "Oh, you're not in turbulence, so you don't know what you're talking about." We've got our own correlations, and we can deal with turbulence. So no, there's no point us talking to you because you don't understand the problem. And sorry to say, that was quite prevalent, particularly when these new techniques were coming up. And if you look at the human side of it, it's I've just built this research group up on my turbulence algorithms, and I'm not going to have some guy coming in telling me I don't know what I'm doing because I've published 50 papers on it. So there was a bit of that, and I think that was throughout the field, whether you were doing aerodynamics or doing multi-phase flows. So a group, and they weren't working together. And so there's probably a hell of a lot of crossover between the stuff that you were maybe doing and that I was doing. But and you start to see this when you work with other people, because I remember coming to your seminar a few months ago for ACFR, and I thought, hang on, that's a problem I've seen before. So it's, I don't think it's changed. I hope people work together better now, but
yeah, well, by having people like you come and talk to people like us, we're making steps in the right direction.
Yeah, interesting question. Yes.
Thanks for the talk. I'm really fascinated, excuse me, by the PIV. And to complement the historical question, to ask a future-looking question.
Yes. Yeah.
What are the main pain points in PIV today? Like, what are the main performance areas that should be improved?
Yeah. So with PIV, so the question is how's it because there's some people online. How's PIV going to improve now? The thing that's really driving PIV improvement now is image resolution. It's always been to do with that. And then the holy grail of PIV, and I've talked about it generally, but is to get a volume measurement. We're talking about planar measurement, and we can get 3-dimensional planar, 2-dimensional planar. That's kind of a piece of cake now. But where it really gets difficult is when you have a volume and you're trying to track individual particles inside a volume, because you get lots of limits in terms of tomographic restrictions on, and you get ghost images and you start tracking the wrong thing. And it's probably exactly the same problems that you get in your field. And there's been a lot of work done on tomographic PIV, but at the end of the day, a lot of it comes down to image resolution and the field of view. And that's and so there's some physics and some things like Nyquist criteria that you just can't beat. You can't get over it. So the sensor resolution is definitely driving the performance of where PIV is going. And there's some odd little tweaks, like the peak fits get better and the number of bits in the image goes up, and that helps. But the old problem still seems to be there. There was one thing with PIV where it might go, and I'm basing this on what was going on with photography in the 90s. One major bit of work, it was done in a professor at Loughborough where I was working, and there was one in the States. They did holographic PIV. So they actually recorded the flow volume on a hologram, and then they reconstructed the hologram, and they literally could move their interrogator through the hologram and find all of the data, the particle images. It was a hell of a bit of work, and there's a couple of papers on that. At the time, we were restricted to holographic film. We couldn't you couldn't get a hologram on digital format. The resolution is nowhere near it because holograms give you, 1,000 lines per or whatever. There was they're amazing resolution. But now with the sensors coming on board, which offer these really high resolutions, potentially we can go back and revisit that, and we could do full digital holographic PIV. And then the issue of ambiguity and ghosting and trying to track things goes, because you can then just digitally fly through the reconstructed volume and find everything. So that's where it might go.
Two comments. And so digital holography and light field imaging are basically the same. And there has been a bit of work on light field PIV.
Yeah.
I'd be excited to talk more about that.
That's good.
Light fields.
Yeah.
The other comment is another field that is concerned with imaging volumes of particles and approaching the limits of their sensing systems is microscopy.
Okay.
And it occurs to me that a lot of the recent tricks they're using to overcome diffraction limits and overcome microstrains might transplant well into this, because it is imaging particles and hitting optical limits.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot of crossover. It comes back to Ian's initial point or question that if the fields got together, we probably would find there's a lot more in common. But yeah, it's interesting to know. Cool. Yes.
Thanks very much for talk. Just wondering if you see any application of new types of sensors like event cameras, neuromorphic sensing, to things like PIV.
Yeah, potentially. I'll have to admit I don't know a lot about them, but the key with current PIV, we went over things like tomographic PIV, where it's a lot of limitations. Maybe there's room for AI in doing some of the work that I did on my software originally, when you're just moving around checking stuff, because that's the only way you can do it, and it needs some interpretation. So I'm not sure about event cameras, but my feeling is with AI and the way it seems to be going, that maybe that will latch into the field somehow, and some of this processing, very intensive post-processing and decision-making maybe will improve PIV. But tell me what an event camera is. I'm like, what is it?
So you have it's an image, but it doesn't actually take an image. It measures the difference in pixel values. So if you think about it, you'd be able to track the trajectory of the particle as it goes through.
So the camera's doing that constantly.
Yeah, the camera has a temporal axis to it.
So that's got a good applications immediately in high-speed flows, because in high-speed PIV, there's always you have to take the data and then wait and process it. If you could do it real time, that's got some benefits as well, particularly for fluid mechanics and looking at time series and things like that. So that might advance that sort of high-speed PIV area potentially. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Does anyone else have a question? Raise your hand. Online as well. You can unmute yourself.
Anyone online, or they're cowering under the sofa?
There are some people.
Yeah. I've got one more question here, but are any online? Yes?
Yeah, as we're talking about different sense of medium, I was just curious, was there any immediate doubt? So because you showed off one of the cameras before that you filmed, and is there any, how does it compare with film and digital resolution?
Yeah, so if we go back to holographic holograms, now look, I think there were 1,000 line pairs per millimeter. So that's, we talk about dots per inch. This is you can resolve a dark and a light and a dark. That's a dark is a line and a light's a line. You can do effectively 2,000 per millimeter. That's the kind of holographic resolution that you can get. So I don't know what the sensors are compared to that now. I know the sensors are going in directions so fast you can't keep up with them. When we first did PIV, the first big sensors, which were a couple of megapixel, were $30,000–$40,000. Well, now you can get you've got bloody iPhone's got 30 megapixels, and it comes when you buy it. So it's I'm not sure where we are, but we might be getting close to 1,000 line pairs a millimeter, maybe. Don't know. That's a question for the floor. But when you get to that level, holographic stuff is possible. And then it comes down to the frame rate. How do you get the frame rate?
Probably would be, because 20 megapixel image is a few thousand pixels across.
Yeah, and it's
they're
only a few.
millimeters.
Yeah, so it's getting close.
So,
Yeah, it's getting close.
Does anyone else have a question?
I've got to run.
Oh yeah, thanks, Ian. Yeah, see you later. Yeah.
If not, then it's 1 o'clock. So,
Thanks, Bill. Thank you.